Hi everyone, this is Kyle Welch with RCR Wireless News, and on today's webinar, we'll be talking with Monica Paolini, President and Founder of Senza Fili, about voice over Wi-Fi and VoLTE, and the return of focus towards voice. I'd now like to hand the presentation over to Monica to discuss the role of VoLTE in voice over Wi-Fi.
Thanks, Kyle. It's a pleasure to be here today and to talk about voice. And thank you all for calling in. Well, voice, and let me get to the next slide here. It's something that I have not worked much on lately, and I got interested in writing the reports initially because of all the technical issues surrounding voice over LTE and the introduction of Wi-Fi calling. So initially, I got interested in voice again after a few years because of the challenges that we were seeing there. The adoption of VoLTE was not going as quickly as we initially expected, and so I thought it would be interesting to see what's going on in there. It turned out that it became a very fascinating report to write, but for different reasons. What I realized as I was working on, again, on the technology side, is that what VoLTE and Wi-Fi calling are doing is to change a service, which is this oldest service we have on cellular, and make something completely new. And so today, I'm going to talk about this. So how we have a change in technology that changes the way voice is being processed and managed in mobile networks, but also how we use voice, how operators can roll out voice services, and finally talk about the revenues. So voice is still voice, but everything we do with it is changing very rapidly, and that makes it a very interesting topic, I think. And today's webinar is a preview of a report that is going to be published on June the 2nd. It's another report in collaboration with RCR Wireless, and it has interviews with the sponsors, which I'm going to talk about at the end, and also 3 operators interviews with T-Mobile, SmartFriend, and AT&T. So let's get started. So as I said, with voice, what's interesting is that it's the same service that we always have, but it's really getting a new life. And so, operators would think that they know how to do voice, but when they started deploying voice over LTE, Wi-Fi calling, they realized that there was a lot of learning to do. And so there has been a lot of work, a lot of effort on their end, because they have to change the way they manage traffic, how they assess quality of voice, how they optimize the networks for voice. And this is something that is not just introduction of VoLTE and Wi-Fi calling, but it's the fact that they are our ability to optimize networks in real time. It's improving quickly, and it just happened at the same time as VoLTE is being introduced. How to build new voice services, and then how to get revenues from voice, or as we will see, maybe not to get revenues from voice specifically. And so the way voice is changing is that it's no longer a person-to-person type of service. We still call each other, but increasingly we use voice through other applications as a follow-up on text, or as an initial part of a video call. So everything becomes part of a data-centric usage model where we have multiple devices. We switch from one device to the other, and we use different services. And this adds complexity, but also it's a lot of opportunities for operators, which include voice, but also other types of data. Okay, so as I said, this was the initial motivation for the report. Why is it VoLTE is such a great technology? Why is it so slow why is the adoption so slow? And I think that what we are seeing recently is that the uptake has accelerated, and the reason for that is that because the technology has become more mature. And so operators are moving, but it's still true that circuit switch voice was much simpler. Well, maybe not simpler, but it was obviously a much more mature technology. Operators knew how to deal with it. And because coverage for voice, it's been relatively good. So a lot of the reason to deploy LTE was the need for more capacity to support data applications. They were less, there was less urgency to deploy VoLTE. And in fact, for a lot of operators, the desire to deploy VoLTE is to have a better voice and data experience, because to have voice and data on the same interface, it makes things better. So so now finally they got to the point where they have an increased, there is many more operators that have VoLTE, and Wi-Fi calling has also been supporting other to promote IMS-based voice, and also to get, so they sort of as precursor to VoLTE, and also to promote a new type of voice. Now, let me just start saying, I realized I forgot to say, but here with Wi-Fi calling and voice over Wi-Fi, what I'm mostly talking about is an IMS-based type of voice service, which is similar to voice over LTE. So when we have voice calling and voice over LTE, both based on an IMS core, what you do have is a full integration between the two services. And I'm going to talk more about it, but I just want to make sure that we all are on the same page on that. Okay, so with VoLTE, clearly there is a switch of, to an IP-based, packet-based type of voice. So you don't no longer have resources that are specifically allocated to voice as you have in circuit switched. So voice has to coexist with data, and data is accounting for the majority of traffic. So voice accounts for a smaller and smaller part of the overall data usage. This is not because voice usage is declining, but it's because data usage is growing at a much faster rate. So what the natural question that comes up is that, well, if voice is such a small part of traffic, do we still care? How important is it? It's important decreased. And the truth is that voice is still crucial. And I think that when we look at all the graphs in terms of traffic, we need to keep in mind that not all the traffic has the same value, the same importance. So the value from a financial point of view, from a revenue point of view, from a cost point of view, how much it costs to support that type of traffic, and what is the value to the subscribers. So in a graph like the one you're seeing here, if we just assume that this and the data component and the voice component are the same, it's wrong, because the value is different. So in that respect, voice is still crucial. It needs the investment and the effort from the operator to manage it properly. The fact that it's a small percentage doesn't really change the basics of it. Now, at the same time, when we look at this, that suggests that capacity is the main the main differentiator. That's unique capacity to support more data, more voice, more video. And that's certainly true. But increasingly, especially when you get into congested environments, latency, jitter, and packet loss become just as important. So there is no point having huge amounts of capacity if the latency is high when it comes to real-time services like video and voice. So we need to really be aware of that. It's not just capacity is not the only factor here. At the same time, with VoLTE, we have new codecs that give some flexibility in terms of working with the network conditions to adjust to performance. And what that takes us is to the fact that we can use real-time optimization to manage voice and data coexistence, because at the end of the day, the two are working on the same channel, and we need to make sure that that's the coexistence is of the right one, both within VoLTE and then, as we'll see, with Wi-Fi calling. Now, the interesting thing about VoLTE is that it has better support for new codecs that have better voice quality. Most of the operators that have VoLTE also have HD voice, and the voice quality becomes much higher. So in this sense, voice becomes almost an entertainment. Here I call it an entertainment channel, but voice is no longer something that you use to communicate crucial things where you talk to somebody, but you accept the quality is not as good. The quality is really getting much better, conversational video too. So voice becomes more of something that we do for fun in a way, and especially when it's embedded in other services, or for work in terms of providing services to subscribers, so not just on a person-to-person basis. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. This is all the details of the specific new codecs that are enabled, but basically what they do is that they are able to give a voice experience that it's closer to natural. So we are getting to the point where the same type of quality that we get with music, we're getting with voice. So that is again, this is quite valuable, and you obviously need a little bit more capacity for that and a better way to manage traffic. Okay, so so as I said, capacity is not the only the only feature, the only required ingredient to have a good quality of experience voice, a good high quality voice. So operators need to pay more attention to other dimensions like latency. How to do that, what that means is that they need to pay attention to a wider range of metrics. So the traditional one, MOS drop calls, are still relevant. This is for instance data from Vodafone that just released a few days ago, and you can see, drop call setup success. I mean, clearly those are not going to go away anytime soon. They're just still important. But equally important becomes the fact that you need to put these KPIs into context, and if something goes bad, understand what goes bad. And if you might have a call that doesn't drop, but if the latency is high, the quality is not going to be good, and so that is going to be reflected on the MOS, but at the same time, you need to understand where is the problem coming from. So to know that you don't have good voice quality, it's not sufficient. You need to be able to go back, backtrack, understand where the problem is, and fix it. And increasingly, you can do it in real time. And so that adds some complexity, but it also allows operators to make the best use of the resources. And this is also for conversational video, which it's really becoming an add-on to voice. It's sort of a rich voice service. Now, we will talk later about voice over Wi-Fi, but I just want to add here that adds a layer of complexity in how you assess and optimize voice. Wi-Fi is not a technology that was initially developed for voice, but in some cases where you do not have cellular coverage, Wi-Fi voice can be an extremely useful way to provide that coverage. But at the same time, it could also be a situation where the voice quality is not ideal. Because you're still in an indoor environment, you might not you might be at the cell edge, and whatever. The question is that how do we treat that? Should we have the same performance targets? When you talk to people, you get a sense that even if the call wasn't perfect, it's still better to be able to make a call than to have no coverage whatsoever. So if you look at it from a mobile operator at the sort of average point of view, you might have a situation where the average quality, if you look, for instance, at these cases, might be a little bit lower, but subscribers are happier because they have better coverage. So how do we deal with those trade-offs? And that's all something that we have not dealt as an industry yet, but I think that we need to start thinking about it. And then we need to, at the same time, monitor and optimize voice in the context of a network that also uses data. So you need to look at both at the same time. And let's see. Okay, voice over Wi-Fi. So there are basically two new things in voice. There is VoLTE first, and then voice over Wi-Fi. And voice over Wi-Fi has been around for a very long time. T-Mobile launched the first voice over Wi-Fi with integrated dialer. So we had voice over Wi-Fi, since basically Wi-Fi got introduced with voice over IP. But we also had something very similar to Wi-Fi calling, meaning that you can make make and receive calls using your mobile number and your handset with UMA for a very long time, for nearly a decade. And T-Mobile in the US was the precursor, the first to go with that. And what we have now, which is quite different, is that all the traffic is integrated with the IMS. So the integration is better. So not only you share the dialer, but there is a lot of functionality that is shared, and there is a lot of value to that. But at the same time, we have to sort of realize that there are different types of Wi-Fi voice. So we have, and here I'm trying to show it in the graph here. So if you look at voice over Wi-Fi, it's both voice over fixed and mobile devices, and that's sort of the very first one. It's like voice over IP. There are some mobile devices that just use VoIP for specific verticals, and other, you can use it on your laptop and so on and so forth, desktop. But then you can have mobile devices, and this is what for a long time most people, and still today, most people use voice applications over OTT applications such as Skype. Now, what I'm talking mostly about today is the operator-run voice over Wi-Fi or Wi-Fi calling. The Wi-Fi calling terminology is more, it's been introduced by Apple, and it often refers to an Apple version of it, but it doesn't really obviously have to be that way. But that really, it's sort of an IMS-based voice over Wi-Fi type of service. But when I talk about voice over Wi-Fi, oftentimes I refer to this one as well. So what's new with the IMS type? We have, well, first of all, we have advanced Wi-Fi capabilities because they are available now. Better support for mobility, handoffs between the two. We used to have them with UMA too, but with time we're getting better at that. The integrated dialer, so you can make and receive calls on your phone. You, as a subscriber, you don't need to know you're using Wi-Fi. Integration in the mobile core allows you to use policy, advanced traffic management techniques to decide where the traffic should go, and then we have handoffs. And from an operator point of view, this is great news because operators initially treated Wi-Fi as a threat to revenue, so the OTTs are stealing revenues, voice revenues from the main service. It's no longer like that because they no longer charge, many of them, for minutes of use. There is always a data and voice package, so it's no longer considered a threat, but it's a tool to improve coverage and subscriber satisfaction. A lot of operators are basically saying, well, subscribers want to have Wi-Fi, so that in itself, it's a sufficient reason. But also in some places, the coverage is not quite what it is, especially in a residential environment. You're not going to put necessarily any more infrastructure. So if somebody uses their own Wi-Fi, why not? It's everybody gains. So, but at the same time, Wi-Fi calling allows you to offer, this additional service for voice, but it's not a replacement for VoLTE or cellular voice. The two perform very different functions. And what I'm saying here for voice, it really could apply to data. And it makes sense because increasingly voice is a data application, not just because it goes over IP, but because the way we treat it is more like, a special case of data. So voice over Wi-Fi is stronger indoors, where you have that in the coverage. There is a large installed base that it's there, so and the devices support Wi-Fi. What that means is that the infrastructure cost is lower. Now, obviously, you have to be careful because Wi-Fi can actually be quite expensive if you deploy it in the wrong way in the wide area, so on and so forth. But the fact is that you have it in the handset already, and you have a lot of infrastructure out there. So even if you have to improve the infrastructure a bit, it's still very low cost. And at the same time, it is more difficult to control for quality in a Wi-Fi network because Wi-Fi was not built from the ground up for voice. So voice is something that is added on top. And it works very well in some circumstances, but when you start having networks at capacity, you start having interference, the quality is impacted. And there is really no way around it because you use unlicensed spectrum. So from an operator point of view, you decide what goes onto your license channels, and you can prioritize traffic whichever way you want. Over Wi-Fi, there's just so much you can do because there are other legitimate users of that spectrum. So it's having voice over Wi-Fi does not exonerate the operators for providing a good voice over LTE service or cellular service. Okay, so let's move on here. This is just a little bit of more detail. Probably most of you know how this works, but so to recap, the same phone number is used for when you use voice over Wi-Fi or VoLTE or 3G, 2G, whatever voice technology you're using. It's the same dialer, so as a subscriber, you don't know that, or you don't need to know that it's going over Wi-Fi. It's the way you use voice is the same. The integration with IMS, we need to keep in mind that it's not only for voice, but it goes over to text and video, conversational video too. So what that means is that conversational video for basically video calls becomes a natural extension of voice. So increasingly, we often, we might text to each other and then call each other, and then the call that initially is just audio becomes a video call. And this is what I hear from operators that subscribers want. Is the conversational video becomes really an add-on, or it's just the natural extension of voice. It's just a richer voice where you added the visual dimension to it. Now, this the integration of the two of LTE and Wi-Fi allows operators to use policy to decide which calls go on which channel. And again, as I said before, this should be done in conjunction with managing data traffic. So operators might decide to have a policy to decide if, for instance, you might try to have more data go through Wi-Fi and keep voice over cellular, for instance. The handoff is still supported, but it's really challenging because the two technologies, LTE and Wi-Fi, have a very different approach on how to take the call on their own network. So sometimes what you have is a ping pong effect where you have LTE trying to get the call, Wi-Fi trying to get the call again, and that's you want to minimize that. So so there are multiple ways to deal with it, but there is really no well, let's put it this way. It's unlikely that we will have the same type of handoffs that you have within cellular, within the same technology. So it's always going to be less optimal. On the other hand, there is a question of how important are handoffs. And clearly it's important to be able to hand off. But oftentimes when we make a call, if we are in a highly mobile environment, we use cellular. And if we are in a very stationary environment and we use Wi-Fi, we stay on Wi-Fi. So the handoffs are probably do not involve most of the calls that you have out there. Now, as I said before, the voice over Wi-Fi and VoLTE are highly complementary. So for an operator, it's not one or the other. At the same time, there are multiple deployments model where the timing of the introduction of VoLTE and voice over Wi-Fi using either IMS or an OTT platform, so basically an app that sits on the phone, are different. So there are some operators that launch both at the same time, some that go with VoLTE first, some that goes voice over Wi-Fi first, because voice over Wi-Fi allows them to get the IMS working on its own. And then they take LTE into the mix. So it's a way to, or they might not have their LTE network available. So voice over Wi-Fi, it's a way to progress towards VoLTE. Sometimes what the operator might start with voice over Wi-Fi using an OTT application. That's the case, for instance, with 3 in the UK. And then once they have VoLTE and they introduce voice over Wi-Fi. So there are different stages. Eventually, operators are committed to VoLTE, and so it makes sense to go that way. And so here we have. I'm trying to show that there are very, very different ways to use Wi-Fi on cellular networks and for different type of providers. So there are some operators, mobile operators tend to do a cellular first. So even if they're strong proponents of Wi-Fi, like T-Mobile and AT&T, they're all, they've been pushing Wi-Fi usage, but at the same time, they want to provide the best experience to the subscribers, and obviously on the mobile network they have much better control. So they try to keep their subscribers on the cellular network, and then but encourage Wi-Fi usage when it makes sense. And then there are some operators like 3 in the UK that is using an OTT solution for Wi-Fi calling ahead of the launch of VoLTE, and so they still offer the service, but it's clearly different because they don't have the IMS integration, and you'd expect that they will add it at the eventually. SmartFriend is an interesting one because, and you will read it in the interview, because what they did is that they deployed voice over LTE, and it's fully integrated with deployed voice over LTE, and now they are introducing Wi-Fi calling integrated with IMS. But because of their own special circumstances, they also need an OTT application so that they can get more of their subscribers using voice over Wi-Fi. So this is also an interesting development, a special case. So depending on the requirements, the operators have different ways to address them. Then there are other operators that the Wi-Fi first, and some of them are actually use IMS in their core. But other ones like Google Fi or Public Wireless are basically MVNOs, and they are Wi-Fi first, and they have a dialer integration and everything, but it's now done through an IMS-based service. So that is another way to offer Wi-Fi, voice over Wi-Fi. And then there are freewheel MSO based, and it's basically Wi-Fi only. And then you have Skype. I just put Skype here, but there is clearly many different providers of OTT voice service, and those are either Wi-Fi first or Wi-Fi only. Well, Skype, obviously, it's both. It's supported by both, and you just you have a huge variety there, and that's, I would argue that it is companies like Skype and all the others that provide OTT solutions that have pushed, had a very good, very positive role in pushing Wi-Fi calling to happen. Now, this is, I talk now on VoLTE and Wi-Fi calling, but what the transition is allowing is something that is quite interesting, with some other development that are happening in conjunction to this. And I'm going to talk about it for the rest of the final minutes on the webinar. So the first one that it's important is the reaching out for non-SIM devices. And the reason why this is important in the context of voice is because let's say you're doing some web browsing or even video streaming. You can do it on any device. You don't need a SIM device if you have a Wi-Fi coverage. So if you are at home and you have your tablet doesn't have a SIM card and doesn't have any basically doesn't have any need, because you use the tablet most of the time at home or in places where there is Wi-Fi. You have the same web access, video streaming. It doesn't really matter. The SIM doesn't matter. When it matters is when you have a voice call, when somebody's trying to call you, or you want to call somebody and you want to be recognized as you. And so the reaching out for non-SIM devices that we are seeing right now, it's very important in the context of voice, because it makes voice to have the same degree of availability across devices, which was not the case. And that was the reason why applications like Skype had a huge advantage, because I can use Skype on any device, and Skype will know it's me as an individual. With cellular, what we still have today, you call my cell phone numbers, and that's the device that rings. Any other device that I might have sitting on in front of me, it's not going to be reached. And the support for non-SIM devices addresses that issue, that I might want to receive my call on the tablet, or I might want to receive it to some other device, but still be linked to the same basically account, or I think it's more appropriate to describe it as a personal identity. And then every user might have more than one personal identities to separate different type of content that they receive. But at the same time, it's important that it's not tied to a device. It's tied to a personality identity that I decide to create and have. And so it all started with, well, Apple was probably the very first mover again, although they tend to have a walled garden approach, so they reach non-SIM devices that happen to be Apple devices, but many people that tend to have an Apple phone, they have also Apple tablets, so on and so forth. So it makes sense to have this kind of the ability to route calls to any device that the user has. Google has done a lot of work too with Google Fi and Hangouts. So if you use a if you have a Google Fi phone, all the the calls can be routed to any device that has Hangouts. And that's, that can be a huge advantage. And to some extent, the ability to use Hangouts allows you to have that in many devices out there. AT&T has introduced number sync that allows you to, again, reach multiple non-SIM devices. And that makes, so this whole approach makes sense in a context where we use a lot of devices. We have many devices out there, but not all of them need to have a SIM card because they're not, we don't use them necessarily in the mobility environment. The cost of having a SIM card, well, in the current model, you just it's difficult to add the same a SIM device and have them all connected to the same phone number. So this makes a lot of sense and encourages people, well, facilitates the use of multiple devices within a consistent context. So you can use similar applications or the same applications in different devices at different times depending on what you're trying to do. So that's very empowering for the subscriber's point of view, and from the operator point of view, it's basically making improving the experience without any downside, because people are trying to do that anyway. It's just you just make it easier for them to do. So it's just de facto recognition of what's going on. And it's not that people are going to cancel their mobile accounts just because of that. So it's not you're not cannibalizing anything. You're just actually making the service more pervasive and broader in scope. And again, you're reaching out for the subscriber and not the device. And I think that's really very high, adds a lot of value. And so it's not a way to lower bills, but it's a way to create value. Okay, so phone number. That's the next thing, is if you start reaching non-SIM devices, what that means is that the phone number becomes a way to identify the subscriber, which it already is, but is only tied to, as I said, to one device. So you can reach to different users, and that adds a lot of values to the service that the operators give. And I think that today they have not been leveraging that value as much, but now I think they can, because it's a way to define, not to define a service plan, but to define the identity of the subscriber. And I think that's interesting that WhatsApp just added the desktop app so that you can basically use WhatsApp on your desktop using your mobile number, which before you could only do with a huge amount of pain. So, and as I said, this is basically allows operators to compete more directly, or to compete better with OTTs that have this ability to reach subscribers across devices more widely. Okay, so I started talking to this before. Right now, voice is no longer a person-to-person service, but it becomes more dependent on data or integrated with data. So oftentimes we text to each other and say, can I call you now? So voice and data become really much closer related. And also there are a lot of applications that then use voice on top or within the application. And a video also, as I said, becomes linked. You just go from voice to video. IoT applications will also introduce new data services that will embed voice. And the increased use of Wi-Fi may also change usage models in the sense that it encourages access in the same way that it has done for data. Now here, the graph shows you that increasingly people don't use standard voice calls on mobile devices. And I think that part of it is because we have a richer way to communicate. It's much more diverse. And the role of traditional voice calls might decrease, even though we might use even more voice. Now, what that means is also that the voice revenues in this kind of context become impossible to isolate. And I see all the time when people try to say, well, X percentage of revenues are due to voice, so voice is still important. I would take exception to that because voice is still important. No doubt about it. But to say that the percentage of revenues go to voice, it's very difficult because operators don't sell services that way anymore. And so it's very difficult to attach a percentage value, even when it comes to switch voice. So we need to think about the value that voice provides in terms of the value to the user, the ability to keep the user attached to the network. And so in the same way that it would be very difficult to calculate video revenues you cannot do it on the basis of the volume, because that would that would also be not the right way to go. So I think that in this data-centric model, the way we look at revenues is different. So to speak about voice revenues, I speak only with great uneasiness about that. It's just the service. And increasingly, that's a lot of operators have stopped to look at voice revenues, and so I think that it's time to move on. Now, said that, what is going to be the impact for voice over Wi-Fi? So one thing I think it's becoming clear is that it's not a revenue. It doesn't cannibalize revenues. But you've probably seen this graph from Cisco's VNI that predicts that the voice over Wi-Fi volume of calls is going to be higher than VoLTE or voice over IP. And when I first saw this, I thought, well, it cannot be true. But then when you think about it, it's the same. I think it's really what's happening here. It's the same that we have with data. Wi-Fi accounts for more data than cellular, and yet that doesn't lower the importance of cellular or of Wi-Fi, because if there were no Wi-Fi, then we'd use less data. So again, you need both, and it's for the usage model. A lot of the data and voice use that we see is in residential environments and work. And there you typically have Wi-Fi, you have good Wi-Fi in most cases. So why not use voice over Wi-Fi when the quality is the same? I use voice over Wi-Fi all the time. I don't even notice that. I don't even do it on purpose. It's just easy. And so at some point it becomes a why not? In the same way that you use Wi-Fi for data, why not? As long as you can get good coverage, and as long as you can switch to cellular, whatever, whenever you are in a position where Wi-Fi is not there. So Wi-Fi becomes the first, the first interface that you use if that works well enough. So to summarize, what is the future of voice? And I think here it's in a way it's sort of almost ironic to talk about the future of voice, because it's you think that it's just going to stay there, and in fact it is changing a lot. It is becoming truly a data service, not because we're just going over IP, but because it's being managed as a service, and the type of services that you can build as an operator around it, they look more like data services. That doesn't mean that voice is not crucial. It's just as crucial as it was before. That is something that they basically take for granted. And now I realize that the second point here, it might be a little bit misleading. What I say is that generally subscribers are not willing to pay for it. What I mean is that subscribers are willing to pay and to select an operator that has good voice quality. They will not take bad quality. So I think that the bar is raising with respect to the what is acceptable in terms of voice quality and coverage, but they're not willing to pay more for it in terms of, you cannot charge more for HD voice, you cannot charge more for VoLTE, or you do not charge on a per minute basis. So we need to get out of that type of frame of mind when we want to evaluate the assessment, to assess an investment in voice. That logic does not work very well, because you cannot say I invest X and I get Y in terms of new revenues. It's not that simple. It's more complicated. It's a question of customer retention and the ability to provide a service that the users are happy about. So it's a little bit more difficult to quantify. Which is then takes us to the next one, which is voice revenues. Do they still exist? It's not a question of the importance of voice. It's just that it's difficult to take them separate from the rest. Now, IMS voice enables operators to embed voice and video more effectively. We talked about that. I think this is a huge advantage for mobile operators as they compete with OTT. Voice is more than person-to-person call, when we talked a lot about that. And finally, conversational video, I think it's going to become much more important. For a long time, people didn't want to use it. They felt it was awkward. That feeling, it's really, the approach that we have to conversational video, I think it's changing very rapidly. And the fact that you can do video as a sort of, within the same framework, the same dialer and everything, helps a lot. So this is all I have to say from the main report. The report has interviews with the sponsors, and the interviews are pretty long and in depth. And I really like working on the interviews, because what you learn a lot about, not what the sort of the mainline message, the sort of marketing message of the sponsor, but try to understand why is it they do what they do, and what are the reasons, what are the problems they're trying to solve. So I usually have a lot of fun working on them. So I'll give you a quick overview of what I talked to them about. And that the transcript of the interview is available in the report, but you can also look at the video of the interviews at the same time. So with Cisco, I talked about voice over Wi-Fi in the enterprise, and how the two coexist. And this is an interesting issue, because the enterprise has its own Wi-Fi infrastructure, their own data requirements on that infrastructure, but they also want to have good coverage for voice. How do you do this? You know, and here there is a lot of collaboration that you need between the enterprise and the operators, and that's something that it's important to think about, because it's a new way to it's something new, because for data the issue is a little bit different. Then with geo communications, we talked about the evolution of voice testing. Testing, I think it's testing and monitoring and optimizing. It's becoming much more interesting in the current networks, and it's going to be, the importance is going to grow as well. And because operators have not only have access to the data, but they're increasingly able to use that data to optimize their network and extract more value from their infrastructure. So optimize the use of the infrastructure, it's crucial, because that effectively that also keeps their CapEx cost under control. And so virtualization is going to have a substantial impact in the way we optimize networks, and VoLTE is one of the first functions to be virtualized. So it's a good test case, even if you're not interested specifically in voice. And we look at the end-to-end testing. So sometimes everything might look like it works fine, but the quality at the end is not good. So you need to be able to backtrack and understand what are the root causes of a problem. And then EXFO, we talked about analytics and how they can help to make sure that the quality of experience, the voice service works as expected. And so so there is a lot of change going on in this area. And one thing that I talked to Michael about is the need to do all the to have all this effort within the organization and having the different unit, different parts of the organization talking to each other. Because when you look at end-to-end, not only you're looking at end-to-end performance and for different network elements, but you also look at different groups within the organization, within the mobile operator organization. And I would say also from a vendor point of view, you tend to have different vendors and different parts of different groups within the vendors from the vendor point of view as well. And I think that we need to increasingly, if you want to have real end-to-end assessment of performance, have the different group talking to each other and collaborate in terms of understanding what goes on in the network and how to improve it and optimize it. Mitel, we talked about, again, enterprise, but we also talked a lot about the fact that when we are talking to each other, the use cases are really expanding a lot in the sense that it's not person-to-person call, device-to-device. It's becoming much richer and more, well, from a subscriber experience point of view, it's richer. From an operator point of view, it's more complex. So from the operator point of view, the key is how to manage this complexity and to use it to their advantage. And I think that there is a huge opportunity there to extract more value from the network, to use network resources more efficiently, which is, as I said before, crucial. And Qualcomm, with Qualcomm, the discussion moved more towards the devices and what is the role of the devices in using the sort of the new voice where you have better quality, more versatility, and how do you make sure that actually works as we expect? So we know that new codecs allow you for a better voice experience. Is that what the subscribers is actually seeing? It's important to really track that and understand what makes a difference. And finally, I talked to Al at Radisys and talk about the quality. Again, the technology allows you to do to have a much better quality. We need to make sure again that everything is working properly, and in the case of having new codec, with the introduction of new codecs, you need to make sure that transcoding also works well. And then you have virtualization. You want to make sure that as you move to a virtualized solution, everything, the quality is, the performance is preserved. And but this is just a little bit of detail on the introduction on the interviews, but I hope you will read them. The report is going to be published on June the 2nd. It's free to download, so you can all get it, and you can register. And I think that everybody that is on the webinar will receive a note when the report is out, so you can download it. And with that, I am done. I'll have Kyle go through the questions.
Yeah, thanks, Monica. Great presentation, a lot of information there, and we got a lot of great questions, so we'll jump right in. First one, so do you need to have VoLTE deployed on the RAN to effectively offer voice over Wi-Fi?
No. So there are some operators that do voice over Wi-Fi. I mean, I assume the integrated one. Obviously, you can have an OTT solution. Some operators, like as I said, 3UK, they have an OTT application, so they can do voice over Wi-Fi without VoLTE or or LTE. It's an over-the-top application. But you can also have an IMS-based solution, so that you can have the IMS core basically only supporting Wi-Fi. And some operators are doing that, especially in developing countries where they don't have an LTE network, and they use Wi-Fi IMS-based Wi-Fi solution as a first step. So in the long term, they want to go they want to have LTE and voice over LTE, but they don't have it yet.
All right, great. And the next question we had come in is, isn't there a concern around security about placing a voice call to a non-SIM device?
Yeah, well, that is something that needs to be worked on, but it is security is a big issue, even when you're using a Wi-Fi network that that is not owned and managed by the operator, an untrusted Wi-Fi network. So I think that when we're looking at all these other ways of routing voice calls, you have to think about security. You can use IPsec, you can use, there are solutions, but clearly something that you need to think about it, and and that's what gives the operators an advantage, because you can trust the operator to provide the same level of security than instead if you use other applications, you might not be as, you might not know exactly the details of how they're securing the communications. So security is something that you can manage, but obviously you have to put an effort into that.
Okay, great. We have time for just a couple more questions. So next one, what is the signaling technology for voice over Wi-Fi and for the handoff to VoLTE?
Well, the handoffs is sort of managed by the handset that decides, and there are different ways to deal with it. And that's a complicated issue, because there is the operator has policies in place that they can use to steer the call to one or the other. There are a lot of 3GPP. 3GPP is standardizing that, but it's really so there are all the standards are in place. It's the way that standards are implemented and the trade-offs that you're willing to accept that make it really complex.
All right, next question we had come in is, what role do you see WebRTC playing in the future of voice communication?
Very interesting question. So Google Fi, I think it's a good example of having WebRTC for a full integration. So WebRTC has been used widely for an OTT application. Now, what Google Fi does uses WebRTC effectively to as an alternative to IMS integration, and that makes sense because Google is a Wi-Fi first type of has a Wi-Fi first type of proposition, and so IMS, it's not necessarily the best solution for them. But there is a question of how to ensure performance if you use WebRTC, because clearly WebRTC does not have the same level of integration. So it's going to be interesting to see how that works, because you can provide very good service with WebRTC, but on the other hand, if you when you do it over cellular, what basically you're doing is that you are not using the full capabilities of LTE for voice calls in terms of optimizing traffic, in terms of optimizing performance. So I think that there is a lot that need to be done, can be done, and I think that there might be some ways to address those potential limitations there.
All right, let's do one more question. So in this one, can you briefly discuss some of the differences needed in emerging markets?
Yeah, well, emerging markets. So a lot of the comments I had for voice revenues and for the use of Wi-Fi calling as a sort of nice and complementary service, they don't work quite as well in developing countries, where you tend to have more of an infrastructure which is based on you pay for minutes of use. Voice is kept to a minimum because of revenue issues. So it's too expensive to pay for minutes. And in those markets, what you tend to see is something a little bit different. That Wi-Fi calling is provided as a way to basically save money and offload traffic. So it's often an offload strategy that allows subscribers to use services that in any case they wouldn't pay for directly because they can't afford it. So it's still, it is still a valuable, for the operator, it's still not cannibalizing. And then, even in those countries, you have plenty of users that are less price sensitive. So for them, the Wi-Fi is still, they use it in a similar way that you tend to use it in countries like US and Europe and countries like Japan or South Korea in Asia. So it's slightly different, but there you still see a lot of interest and a lot of activity and a lot of creative use of Wi-Fi access. And there, oftentimes, there is much more of a public access becomes more important because a lot of people do not have a broadband at home. So residential Wi-Fi, the way we have it, for instance, in the U.S., Europe, or many European Asian countries, we take for granted that we have Wi-Fi at home. In a lot of emerging countries, that's simply not the case. So the public infrastructure is much more interesting. If you see, it's actually interesting. You see in Cuba, where people don't have it's an entirely new service. That people do go to public areas where there is Wi-Fi, and they all congregate there. It's like it's actually quite interesting to see. Because that Wi-Fi there addresses a very different need that it does here.
All right, great. That's about all the time we have today. I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar, VoLTE and Voice over Wi-Fi. Voice comes to the fore again. Our presenter was Monica Paolini, President and Founder of Senza. Thank you, Monica.
Thank you, Kyle.